Chapter 12. Friends from the South. Day and night, Jim and Kevin chipped at the concrete with sections of the rebar that had been cut free. Occasionally, light would rush in from the opening they entered through, and almost as quickly it would go away. But each time, just within the opening, Dawn would leave packages. Often the packages consisted of bread, rice, or jugs of water. Not all of the supplies were for Jim and Kevin, but for the men they were attempting to free. During short breaks from chipping, the two would ask many questions of Sam through the hole as they pushed pieces of bread and rice through. Not believing what he had just heard, Jim asked a little too loudly, "You got yourself captured? Why in the hell would you do that, man? What better way to find out what is going on inside this place?" Sam answered in the form of a question. Jim thought about the answer as he filled the hole with another rolled-up slice of bread. With the mangled slice through the hole, Jim thought of another question. "How did you plan on getting out of there?" Jim thought for sure he had asked the question for which Sam couldn't find an answer. "Who do you think told them where to dig through the wall? I studied the blueprints before the UN bastards brought me here," Sam replied, thinking nothing of the question. Feeling agitated at Sam for always having a good answer to his questions, Jim slid the last of the bread through the hole while mumbling, "I would think there could have been a better plan." Before he could hear a reply from Sam through the hole, he quickly began chipping at the concrete to drown him out. The seconds turned into minutes, minutes into hours, with every strike of the steel rod to the concrete. The two were on a mission to make the hole big enough for the men to exit the cell before guards had a chance to stop them. Carefully, Jim chipped away at what he considered the last stage of his mission, creating the thinnest layer of concrete he could between himself and the men on the other side without going through. The mission he had worked at non-stop since it was presented to him 2 days ago now came down to this: soft strikes moving sometimes just a grain at a time. "Jim! Kevin!" Sam called to them through the hole. Startled awake, Jim opened his eyes to find Kevin still asleep, resting his head in his lap. Rapidly shaking his knee, Jim looked at him and whispered loudly, "Get up, man. We fell asleep. Get up!" Sam could faintly hear the two moving around. As the wall became thinner, the sound from the other side had become so audible, he could hear the two snoring as they slept. It was not long before Sam could hear the soft tapping of the steel rod, sometimes followed by a louder thump. Thump, thump, crack, thump. The sounds grew in frequency as Sam wondered just what the two were doing on the other side of the wall. Hearing the door at the end of the hallway open, Sam quickly spun around away from the wall to avoid any questions as to what he was doing. "Move! Hurry! Get to the front gate! Move!" the UN soldier shouted into the corridor. Sam's heart started pounding as he figured out just what the sounds were and where they had been coming from. One after another, Sam tapped men on the shoulders, though each knew it was time to move way before he had done so. The group of men in the cage with him looked confused about what was happening while Sam turned to the hole and, with excitement in his voice, warned Jim and Kevin on the other side, "Get back, boys. We're coming through." Raising his boot high above his waist, Sam lashed out at the spot with all the force he could conjure. With all his weight behind the kick, Sam had planned on many attempts to get through the concrete, but was surprised when his foot slid through with ease. Two of the men near him grabbed hold of his arms as he began to fall, unable to steady himself with his legs stretched out and stuck in the wall. Thankful for the assistance, Sam looked at the two men. Damn, guess those boys knew what they were doing. Quickly, the two freed Sam's foot from the wall and began pulling at the sides around it, breaking off handfuls at a time. Feeling the adrenaline taking over, Jim couldn't sit still any longer. Crawling closer to the wall and forgetting all about speaking softly, he shouted, "Here, I'll get it. Watch your hands." Before making sure they had heard him, Jim sat down close to the hole and began kicking at the edges with the heel of his shoe. With every strike, massive sections of concrete began falling into the cell. "That's good. We will meet you outside," Sam said, turning from Jim back to the men in the cell and shouting, "You ready for some payback?" Though they were weak from lack of food and water, they each sounded off in kind. "Let's do it." "Yeah." Get some! Just as if the training they'd had in the military had taken place days ago, even though for many it had been more than a decade. Each man dived through the hole and quickly crawled out. Exiting from underneath the building where he and Kevin had spent the last 2 days became a shock to their systems. Slowly, Jim opened his eyes to the sunlight as he stood up straight, while Kevin did the same next to him. Still not quite adjusted to the outside, Jim heard Dawn call his name from close by. "Jim!" Turning in her direction, he could hear that the thumping and cracking sounds from underneath the building had grown louder and more frequent. All around, people ran in an attempt to find safety, unaware of what was happening. Unlike most of the people running, Jim and Kevin understood their next place to be was by the main door to the building. Rubbing his eyes, Jim replied, "They are on their way out." He assumed she was going to ask about Sam and the rest of the men. "Great! The attack has started," Dawn said, now only a few feet away from where Jim and Kevin were, with the surprised looks on their face that the attack was taking place now. Seeing the expression on their faces, Dawn replied, "Sam didn't tell you? Guess he does keep information tight. Hell, he didn't even tell me. I found out." Dawn stopped talking, and panic washed over her face as they heard gunfire come from underneath the building they had been digging to free Sam. Unsure as to what he could even do, Jim spun around and began to head back underneath the building. Grabbing him by the shoulder, Dawn held him back. "There is nothing you can do for them, Jim," she screamed as the image of Sam and the others dying underneath the building filled her thoughts. Staring at the hole leading underneath the building, Jim could feel the cycle of death that had followed him from the start, coming back around once more. "This is why I didn't want to get involved," he said, full of regret. "Get out of the way." A voice came from the hole as Sam's head appeared, followed by a stream of men exiting. Clear of the hole, Sam rolled to his feet and looked to Kevin. "Well, let's see if you're right about the code." Without giving them any information about what had happened with the gunfire, and without waiting for a response, Sam signaled for those who had already cleared the hole to follow him. "Yes." Kevin started running to catch up with him. Happy that so far his cycle of death and sorrow had not caught up with Sam or any of the people he still had a hard time calling friends, Jim ran as well. Running up to the door of the main building, Jim could see Sam sprinting for the keypad. Watching him stop next to it and strike the first key, Jim could feel his anxiety levels rising as Sam pressed 2000. Sam's finger moved for the enter key, which would signal if Kevin had been correct. As soon as Sam pressed the key, a light to the left of the keypad flashed red. "Shit!" Sam yelled. "Try 2001, Kevin said, responding to the red light. Feeling it was a lost cause and wanting to move on to Plan B, Sam turned to face the gates. "We don't have the time to work our way up from 001 to 002. We have to move," Sam stated before stepping away from the keypad to lead the men to other areas of the camp. Jim, being closer to the pad than Kevin, quickly typed in the code and pressed enter. On the right side of the panel, a green light flashed, and they heard a clank of the electronic lock releasing. "Well, I'll be damned," Sam replied, looking over to Kevin, surprised that the code worked. Kevin shrugged his shoulders. Sometimes people feel guilty using the same number 3 times in a row. Without a second more delay, Sam charged through the door, followed by those who were freed from the cell with him. As they ran down the hallway, the only people they encountered were trusties, those they thought to be trustworthy in the camp. "The weapons vault is located down the corridor we were held in," Sam yelled, breaking through a door marked holding area. Just through the door, Sam dived for the startled guard on the other side, knocking him to the ground. Before the guard could pull the trigger on his AK-47, 3 different boots came down on his head, smashing the contents on the floor like a dropped melon. Running through the door after many others, Jim slowed as he discovered what the gunfire earlier was all about. Lying next to the bar still inside the cell were men who used their bodies as a shield to allow those who were more capable fighters to escape. Jim felt his stomach churn at the smell of blood and human waste, but continued to move forward, doing his best to focus on the man to his front. After running down the hall a little farther, Jim could hear the beeping of the keypad as Sam entered Kevin's code, successfully opening the vault door to the weapons. Seeing Sam enter the weapons vault, Jim marveled at what he was doing. 3 months ago he'd been surfing, sleeping in until afternoon, and faking job searches. Now he was hoping to get a weapon to join the fight before they were all handed out. Watching those around him, Jim also found it odd that everyone had formed into a line instead of fighting to get to the weapons. He thought back to the last time he stood in line for a new cell phone, where people had been taken away by an ambulance. Before he knew it, his turn had come, and as the soldier handed him a rifle and 2 magazines, the expression on Jim's face said everything. "Son, ask one of the guys. They will have no problem showing you how to use it." The soldier gave Jim a push on down the hall for the next guy to step up and receive a weapon. Standing next to one of the soldiers, Jim felt a little embarrassed at not knowing how to operate the rifle. Watching the other men put the magazines in, Jim copied what he saw. He could only make it to the point of pushing the magazine in the right hole. Jim couldn't make out what all they were doing to the rifle as they moved fast, slapping, pulling, and pushing on different areas. About the only thing Jim did understand was to keep the end of the rifle pointed to the floor, but as he turned it to see the other side, Jim's heart stopped as he watched the magazine drop from his rifle onto the floor. Doing his best not to look at the others in the hall, Jim bent over to pick it up. But he was beaten to it by the guy next to him, who remarked as he handed it over to Jim, "Damn, you from California or something?" Then he laughed at his own comment. Not wanting to respond, Jim took the magazine and turned away. Thinking it was about time to follow up on the advice given to him when he received the rifle, Jim looked around for someone to ask other than the guy who'd guessed where he was from. Relief and shock came over him when he spotted Kevin walking over, slapping, smacking, squeezing, and pulling at the rifle he had just been given. With a smile on his face, Kevin looked at Jim and said, "Can you believe this beauty?" Shocked that he had been given a weapon at 15, Jim replied, "What are you doing? You shouldn't have that." "What? I've been shooting one of these since I was able to hold it up." "Regardless of how good you are with it, you're still only 15, Jim replied. Kevin looked down at Jim and responded low enough so others around them did not hear, "Yes, sir, and ready to fight." Seeing there was no use in pressing the point, Jim looked at Kevin's weapon, and then to his own. "Show me how to use this, and I won't say a word." Seeing that the men in the hall were ready to move, Sam announced, "We are moving to the roof to provide cover for those approaching. Keep it tight. Let's move." Turning and leading the way, Sam ran down the hall in the direction he recalled seeing stairs on the blueprints he had studied before his capture. Moving through several doors and down a few halls, they met little resistance along the way, and Sam was relieved when he opened the door marked stairs and began running up them. Exiting the door onto the roof, Jim felt his heart pounding in his chest after racing up the 4 flights of stairs. Jim looked to Sam, who stood directing men to different areas of the roof as they exited. Running over to the side of the roof where Sam had pointed, Jim stopped just behind the 2-foot wall around the roof and gazed out over the area beyond the camp, stunned by the sight. Standing there like a hood ornament, Jim let his eyes travel up and down the long line of vehicles and horses that headed for the camp. Pulling Jim down to the roof, Kevin remarked, "I might be 15, but even I know not to stand on a rooftop like a flagpole during a firefight. Now follow my lead and shoot the guys with the blue helmets." Kevin rose slowly while still staying low as he laid the front of his rifle on the top of the wall and began firing. Looking around, Jim could see about half the people on the rooftop using their rifles much like Kevin, and others stood about 5 feet back from the wall firing down into the camp. Feeling that Kevin knew what he was doing even though he was so young, he placed his rifle over the wall and began scanning for the UN personnel. Fairly quickly, he spotted one of the guards exiting a door at the bottom of a guard tower. Placing his front sight post on the guard as he lay down on the ground, Jim placed his finger on the trigger. Suddenly, he felt his body tense up, every thought on what he was about to do, and the internal battle froze all motor functions in his body, rendering him motionless. Since he was a baby, he had been taught it was wrong to take another's life, that guns were evil, and from a young age, he had been saturated with the impression that all would be okay if you just talked and hugged it out. Now he sat on a rooftop with a rifle in his hand, aiming it at the back of a total stranger, as everything in his mind and body screamed how wrong it was. Suddenly the man rolled over on the ground and began firing. His bullet struck the wall just in front of Jim. Letting instinct take control, Jim pulled the trigger, and a stream of bullets screamed from his barrel. Surprised by the rifle fire, Jim looked back at the soldier on the ground. Years of conditioning had been undone by the basic instinct to fight for survival. Feeling the brass strike him, Kevin yelled to Jim, "Take it off auto!" "What?" Jim shouted back, having a hard time hearing. Reaching over, Kevin flipped the selector switch of Jim's rifle from full to semi-auto, and then focused back on the battle down below. Jim fired till he was out of ammunition, which only took a few minutes. Keeping his weapon hanging over the wall, he pretended to be looking for another target. He looked from one side of the roof to another, and was surprised to see many others had also spent what ammunition they held. Happy not to be the only one out, Jim stepped back from the wall while Kevin fired shots slowly, choosing each target carefully. Standing behind Kevin, safe from any bullets coming up from below, Jim waited as he listened to the weapon's fire slowly fading away. The total battle only lasted about 20 minutes from the time they exited out from underneath the building to the last shot, but Jim felt as if it had taken most of the day. Watching Kevin scan down below for another target as the invading force finished clearing the last of the guards from the buildings down below, Jim admired how someone so much younger showed so little fear. Kevin slowly turned around, dropping from his knee to his butt, placing his rifle across his lap as he looked up to Jim and asked, "You okay, buddy?" Seeing the dark red spot where a bullet had struck Kevin in the shoulder, Jim felt his luck with friends running out as he ran over. "You're the one who has been shot, man," Jim said, placing his hand over the hole. Looking down at the blood, Kevin remarked, "I have had worse working on my dad's farm. Just pull my sleeve off and wrap it, would you?" Jim tore both sleeves from Kevin's shirt, folding one up and placing it over the wound. The other he tore in strips, running them around Kevin's chest, over his shoulder, and in any direction he could to apply pressure to the wound and stop the bleeding. While working on the wound, Jim saw Sam heading his way while checking on a few other men who had been wounded. "You boys pulled it off. Everyone on this rooftop owes you. You going to make it, son?" Sam asked, concerned for the young man, as Jim pulled the makeshift bandage tight. "Yes, sir, just a graze. Probably going to need stitching." "That's all," Kevin replied with a grin on his face, having come from a family where the men prided themselves on not complaining about getting hurt. Satisfied that the cycle of death to those around him was not going to take Kevin, Jim stood and looked out over the battlefield, and at soldiers still heading their direction. "Who are they?" Jim asked, turning back to Sam. "What you see there is the Texas and Oklahoma National Guard," Sam replied. Surprised that there was an actual military on the march, after not seeing anything resembling one with the exception of the UN troops for the 1,000 miles he and Larry had traveled, Jim asked, "How?" Rubbing his arm where a large scar ran down his damaged bicep, Sam answered with a smile as he thought back to the day Robert Squires had shot him. "Son, it is because of what happened at the Squires farm.